All right, welcome back to FinTalk, brought to you by Vermex. I'm Jawad Akhtar, your host. So today, welcome back, Nav.
Thank you so
Like
much.
a regular now.
I know. Thank you so much.
Change of scenery this time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful studio.
Yeah, I finally found it. I want to dive into what's been happening in the world of ESG and where we are. I know the FCA released the paper about greenwashing. We know what's going on in Europe and America, but I'm keen to understand what your thoughts are so far and where we are, where the landscape lies.
Definitely. So I think last time we spoke, it was probably over 9 months ago.
Yeah.
And we were at the Future Fit conference as
Yep.
well. And we'll be speaking again in
Exactly. Yeah.
in a couple of weeks' time, maybe as this is published. But I think, look, number one point to think about when we're thinking about greenwashing is, have you got your strategy aligned? Because this is where greenwashing is occurring. And sometimes it is not deliberate greenwashing. The issue that we have is alignment between when we look at sustainability as a group department, where they've got to manage, number one, ESG, number two, climate and nature risks, number three, sustainable financing, number four, thinking about carbon markets, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 carbon emissions, voluntary carbon markets, sovereign carbon markets as well. And last but not least, how are we going to get to net zero? And how do we think about 1.5 degrees? Now, bringing that all together actually opens up issues for greenwashing. Why? Because this topic of sustainability, may I say, is very fluid and very dynamic, and it's changing. Every week there is a new update, be it in the ESG space or the climate risk space or the net zero space. The other issue you have as well is geopolitics as well.
Yeah. There's a big part.
So let's talk about the UK. So when we looked at the UK and what the UK administration were first saying was, i.e. the Conservative administration, push back on net zero, push back on sustainability. Now what we're seeing with the new Labour administration in power is an acceleration. Now, what does that acceleration of the green transition basically mean? That acceleration is basically now all about getting your metrics correct. You must understand that, how does my ESG framework look? In the UK, that's going to be dictated by the UK's SDS, Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which is going to be based off, and lots of alphabet soup as well. And anyone listening to this, Google, as I always say, the ISSB. So the ISSB is now covering roughly about half of sustainability disclosure standards globally, also adopted by the stock exchanges, majority of stock exchanges around the world, and also endorsed by the G20 countries as well. Now, if you're going to get these metrics right, how do I look at the ISSB as a framework? And in particular, S1, which are my general sustainability metrics, and S2, which are my climate risk metrics, which is your TCFD, essentially. That's another update. Now, this is the point where if you are going to go and disclose one of those metrics and you haven't refreshed your framework, you've got a gap there, you've got an issue there. Your data might be stale. Your analytics to calculate carbon emissions or carbon intensity, for example, might be stale as well. Number three, your reporting might not be up to date as well. So going back to first principles, fluid and dynamic changing environment and acceleration in the UK, pushback in the US as well, especially if the Trump administration comes into power. If we think about climate risk reporting in the US, it's about 4 states there which are pushing for climate risk reporting. An example is California. California's rules have basically been pushed out again. What we have to be very conscious of is how geopolitics is going to play out. And the EU the gold standard. They are leading on this via their ESG framework, which is ESRS, linked to the EU taxonomy, which then goes and links into your GAR and your beta, your green asset ratio, and your banking taxonomy alignment ratio as well. But the alignment and the cross alignment between all of these frameworks, get that wrong, you might be disclosing a wrong metric. And where would that metric be disclosed, Javed? Let's say you're issuing a green bond and you label that as a green bond. But again, you haven't refreshed your ESG framework, or you haven't put in the latest updates, or you have maybe you're a UK bank and you have a European entity and you haven't done a cross mapping for where of the use of the proceeds of the green bond is going. So it could be green, but your client could be actually using that for non-ESG purposes.
So this is what we were talking. I'm going to stop you there because there's a lot to gather in there.
A lot to take in, yeah.
We were speaking earlier off record about the impact in UK versus EU, and you're right. EU has kind of is leading the way. We know what's going on in the EU, and if I'm in the EU, I know exactly what I'm doing. There's information out there. It's quite clear on what I need to do, how I need to report it, what I need to report. Everyone else that we see is just still sitting on the fence. I know we've had this change in government. Will that accelerate the regulation of them onboarding what's going on in the EU? I know the PRA have said to me before that they are watching what's going on in the UK. But then I go back to a question we get asked a lot is, look, yes, great what's happening in Europe, but I'm a UK firm. But I'm not going to worry about it. But I'm going to worry about when FCA started to did the greenwashing paper. Now have I got to start to worry about that? And I know you mentioned and you made a point there where yes, I'm a UK firm, but I have an entity in Europe. Maybe for passporting, maybe for any other reason.
Of course, yes.
But they captured. That's it. That capture that happens, and then from that point onwards, you're triggered, right?
So it's a very fair point, but we have to be very clear about those bonds or those loans. Where are they basically booked? They're booked typically to the banking book. Within the banking book, you need to understand how that firm just operating in the UK only? And if they have a use of proceeds, now let's take the example of the green bond I was talking about. Where is the use of proceeds going? Is that going into carbon intensive economic activities, or is that going into the green transition? So going back to your question, the acceleration is now being pushed by the new Labour administration as well. But we need to actually accelerate further so we can basically align with the green transition that's going to expand in terms of like going into renewable energy, for example, or the latest announcement from the UK government where they're going to work with the Crown Estate to basically build more renewable energy, for example, wind farms in seabeds. Now, if you want to go that way and you wanted to do a use of proceeds, well, you need to be very clear about, have I got the framework right? Is the metric that I'm getting from my client, is that plausible? Has it been audited? Have I done assurance on there? Have I looked at their climate transition plan as well? Now, it doesn't matter whether it's happening in the UK or whether it's happening in the EU. We have to align, and global alignment is happening, but it's going to take a good minimum of 5 years. Hence why if you are a CSO or if you are in a reporting function, you need to be very, very up to date with what's happening in those 5 different categories of sustainability that I mentioned: ESG, climate, nature risk, sustainable finance, carbon markets, and net zero.
Yeah, and you're right. But we've heard this all before, haven't we? We heard this with the Conservative government of, yes, then there's an acceleration to with the COP27, COP28 to get to net zero. We're going to do this. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take cars out of the market, go electric, and suddenly there's a stop to it.
Of course,
Obviously,
that's been reversed, by the way.
yeah,
Yep.
with a new government,
Yes,
and it's taken a new government to do that. Again, maybe we go down the line. I know we're speculating,
and aligned with the EU now as well.
and that's what we were expecting to see, the alignment. And the surprise when they kind of stopped it was more of a surprise to see. But then, yeah, and it's how quickly do the new government now push this to
Of course.
happen? You could
Okay.
be ticking a box exercise.
So let's take your example of transition to EV,
Yeah,
right? There's been some consumer pushback, but we also know that petrol is still going to be there, i.e. ICE, the internal combustion engine, is still going to be around for another 5 years,
Yeah.
let's say, for simplicity. Now, we've got to be very clear that, let's go back to the example of green bond. A green bond is basically raised. Does the automaker, such as a Stellantis or a Jaguar, Land Rover, Ford, the use of proceeds, is that going into 50% into making EVs and 50% into combustible engine? And this is where the audit and the assurance perspective needs to be brought in. You also need to be very clear that if you are doing a fund raise or a bond raise for a company and funding their green capex, that green capex, what is the alignment to, for example, the EU taxonomy? We don't have a taxonomy currently in the UK. That is being
Yeah.
developed
yeah,
by the GFI, the Green Finance Institute, under the UK government mandate. So where do you go? And I go back to alignment again.
yeah,
So you'd want to probably go to a gold standard such as the EU taxonomy that says for the auto sector, what are the metrics that need to be reported? What is the carbon intensity of the vehicle coming off the line?
But then we're moving away. I mean, we're going to keep on that track, and we'll just move away slightly. And yes, it's fine moving and having that target to move to it, but then you have the infrastructure. The concern has always been, I'll say, what they call it, the range anxiety, isn't it?
Yes,
It's a range
of course.
anxiety.
Yes, yes.
There just simply isn't enough
Okay.
stations across the country to manage that. If suddenly everyone then suddenly went to electric, you can't manage that. And the
course.
cost now, the cost of electric versus petrol is, before it was, we had road tax was free, and now there's a charge on road tax. Actually, now what's the benefit when the cost of electricity versus petrol starts coming in line? Then what's the value add? What's the purpose?
Okay. So let's again go back to an example of not just a green bond, but green fund, because what the FCA are saying when they look at retail financial products, they look at wholesale financial products as well. Have you the labeling that is taking place under the sustainability disclosure that needs to take place for example, for asset management and their funds in the UK? What is the proportion of the greenness, let me say? And what are the assumptions that those funds, which are going to be invested by, let's say, a Jaguar, Land Rover, a Stellantis, or a Ford, etc., in the UK, is that going to continue? And that's where, again, you need to basically be thinking about, well, hold on a minute. How do I test those assumptions of range anxiety pushback? How do I look at the impact of macroeconomics? I mean, we are currently with 2% inflation. Rates are at 5.25% in the UK. When is the cut going to basically take place of interest rates? Will inflation remain subdued? When will GDP basically pick up?
Yeah.
And how does that factor into disposable income? Now, where do you test all of that, Jawad? You test that in climate risk scenarios. So now you need to refine your climate risk scenarios, because you will be advising the reporting that you are doing will be used for, let's say, a sustainability front office function who are doing green raise, green funding, etc., be it green bond, green loan, etc. They will be advised by looking at the scenarios and how those scenarios are going to play out and what are the different scenarios. Only then can you then say, okay, I am 100% or 90% or 80% certain that I can label this product as green. So there are lots of different moving pieces that need to be brought together.
So we managed to cover a lot, and I'm glad you finished on climate risk, because that's, again, a very topical point. But with firms that have kind of, well, accelerating their ESG data collection and the whole program, because I know from a technology point of view, trying to get data for banking regulation is difficult anyway. Trying to get data for ESG, that's just enormous. That's a whole task, because some data is 20, 30 years old. You have to go back, and firms that have started all this program and then suddenly had to put a pause on it because of government putting a pause on everything as well. Is it just a case of let's kick it back up again? Or is it do we just hold fire and wait for what's happening in the UK? We know what's the EU happening. We'll take care of that. EU's taken care of. But again, being a pessimist, nothing's happening in the UK. Do I wait, or do I actually start the ball rolling to start re-engaging all that, start internally doing?
So when I work with the C-suite,
yeah,
I get these questions. So as an advisor, the C-suite say, do I take action now or do I take action later? And there has been a lot of waiting, to be very frank, and that waiting has been because of geopolitics. We still have tension in the Middle East, tension between Russia and Ukraine, potential scenario between China and Taiwan as well. What does that mean for me in the long term? And again, I bring it back to that's where you use climate risk scenarios to help you identify what are your risks and your opportunities, what are your strengths and your weaknesses in your strategy. And again, you need to basically be thinking about what is my confidence level of the data that I have, and how do you interact with the CDO. So the CDO, the Chief Data Officer, usually has this responsibility of bringing in the latest ESG data. But the problem is ESG data, that it's not like equity prices, tick by tick, millisecond by millisecond. There's no bid sell spread, for example. And we need to be thinking, okay, how often am I going to get these data updates from my client, i.e. the counterparty that's sitting on my, for simplicity again, let's just say banking book. Well, you're only going to get an annual update of what their latest carbon emissions are, for example, what their carbon intensity is, for example, what are their social and governance metrics that are being disclosed as well. Where are they on their journey to net zero? Have they benchmarked themselves in line with the industry as well? And, let's take the auto industry. Majority of automakers are trying to target in the range of 2035 to 2045, if we look at the industry, to become net zero. So again, let's say you have a 7-year green bond booked on your balance sheet, i.e. the banking book. How do you ensure that the labeling is correct? How do you ensure the annual updates and the audit and the controls that you have around your banking book are in place as well? And that's where reporting comes into it, right? Other things you need to be thinking about is, is that client reducing their emissions by, for example, buying voluntary carbon? Are they operating the voluntary carbon markets? Are they buying carbon credits, for example? Or if they are in a power electric company, or they're in an industry like cement, aluminium or steel, are they being forced to buy environmental carbon permits of regulated carbon markets, for example? Now, this is where the understanding of what the firm is doing feeds in, that net zero strategy feeds into, is it 1.5 degree aligned, i.e. the Paris Agreement, their contribution to temperature rise? And then are they using carbon markets to do that, or are they using science-based methods to do that? And how are they recording that in their use of proceeds? If I'm a bank and I am basically providing funding, and am I checking up on that? And what are my controls? And how do I basically measure them to the industry by using an ESG framework? How do I test them looking at climate risk scenarios or nature risk scenarios as well? I hope this is
No, it's
bringing it all together.
yeah, and I think
Get all of that wrong or not being on top of it. You know, how do you advise the front office, right? The revenue generator.
which is what they're worried about, right? It's the bottom line, end of the day. And ultimately,
course.
firms are not charities. But it goes back to the point we're so used to working in an industry where we expect change, regulatory change happens all the time. We get new data items. It becomes like it's become norm now. Change has become norm in this industry, financial services sector. Whereas you look at other industries, manufacturing or people like that, they're probably not near where other industries are. So you require, if I need to know what the carbon emission of my client is, I've got to make sure that they're doing their job as well. So it's kind of making that whole chain has got to work for your reporting to be as accurate as you can possibly make it. But I kind of want to wrap up on your point, because you do a lot of work around, work with NEDs and advisories and C-suites, and
That's right.
you mentioned a point there about, I would look at it from a UK perspective and say, I'm a UK firm. UK ain't doing anything at the moment. They're just talking about it, have been talking about it for years. I'm going to wait. I'm going to sit on the fence. But your point is, and you do this advisory work, so you'll probably say, no, don't. But yeah, keen to hear your kind of points back to the industry.
So look, there has been waiting, but there have been pieces of work where the industry has been focused on, and we need to split it into three areas, Jawed. We need to look at what is sovereign policy, what are corporates doing, what are financials doing, right? Before sustainability became the whole game to be in,
Yeah.
especially after the pandemic, we saw government trying to push corporates to attain sustainability targets. So what sovereign governments have done is effectively handed over their policing of sustainability to financials and made it the responsibility of financials. Hence why the greenwashing question keeps on coming up. I mean, that's what we want. This is what the theme of this podcast is. So the waiting is done now. Geopolitics and 40 plus elections around the world are concluding now, but let's not forget the elephant in the room is the US.
Yeah.
And what we need to be thinking about for the C-suite is, number one, where am I with my strategy? Number two, am I reporting sane metrics as a corporate organization? Number three, what does that mean for myself and perception of my corporate firm to a financial markets firm, such as a NatWest or a Lloyds Banking Group, for example? And what would that mean for my funding cost? And can I bring my funding cost down because I am showing good data, good analytics and good reporting and good alignment with all those moving pieces that I mentioned? And this is what financials now need to do. Financials need to take the guidance that is basically out there, whether it's an ESG framework, a climate risk stress test, sustainability bond, sustainability loan. Don't want to make it too complex, maybe for another podcast. Yeah, but you can now get sustainability-linked derivatives as well now.
Yeah.
That's just a whole other topic. So financials then need to think about, okay, the corporate and the C-suite, what they are communicating in terms of their fundraise and the access to funding that they require, Am I in line with principles that are coming from the FCA, the PRA? Am I following guidance from the BOE, CFRF as well? Also, have I prepared myself for the ISSB, which is going to be part of the UK's SDS strategy if I have a European entity and there's a European corporate I'm interacting with?
Yeah.
Number 4, am I ready for the interconnected differences that we have in metric disclosure as well? And let's not forget those emissions of a client, that funding is a certain proportion of the bank's financed emissions, which is called PCAF, and we won't go into that. But now we need to be very clear, taking step 1, 2, 3, and 4 together. How do you look at that across changing sovereigns, changing corporates and their transition planning for environmental, social, and governance issues? And number 3, how do financials, they're not in one sector. They're invested in hundreds of different sectors and subsectors and supply chain as well. And how do they look at their cost of funding as well and their interaction? And again, maybe for another podcast, but how do we look at the carbon intensity when you have overnight depository? So when you repo out your collateral, so you place your collateral with the Bank of England overnight, the ECB are asking for your carbon intensity of your assets because the ECB wants to make their carbon intensity of any collateral pledged for cash and pay out a premium. Again, very, very experimental, very, very early days. So financials are going to be the driver for corporates, and corporates will want to basically have a good relationship with governments as well, but governments need to be clear about policy. And in the UK, we now have a sensible policy and we have a sensible roadmap that is basically coming out from the new Labour administration. As I mentioned, and to conclude, elephant in the room is the US. If Trump takes the US out of the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degree alignment, you've got to rewrite your whole strategy all over again, whether you're a corporate or whether you're a financial. Exciting times ahead.
Yeah, I will end on that bombshell. We'll discuss a lot of this at the Future Fit conference in a few weeks when we go live. But Nav, again, as always, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jawad. Look forward to the conference and look forward to the next podcast.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.